Rhizosorb is redefining what growers expect from phosphate fertilizer. Backed by data and built for performance, Rhizosorb helps reduce phosphorus losses, improve uptake, and boost ROI without increasing input costs. Join the next wave of growers switching to the next generation of phosphorus fertilizers by visiting phospholutions.com.
RealAgriculture.com presents Frontlines, geopolitics affecting agriculture with Jacob Shapiro of Bespoke Group and Real Agriculture's Shaun Haney. Shaun Haney here with RealAgriculture.com, joined by Jacob Shapiro of the Bespoke Group for another episode of the Frontlines podcast. Jacob, how are we doing?
We're doing okay, Shaun. As I told you before we started recording, I'm recovering from pneumonia, so hopefully I don't hack up a lung while we're talking here.
Well, and I do owe you an apology because yesterday I was trying to send a text message to my daughter's boyfriend. Congratulations for making the next gen Team Canada volleyball team. They're in Mexico, and I was sending a bunch of funny gifs, Mexicans celebrating, and I realized I had sent it to Jacob Shapiro, not the other Jacob. So.
Well, ironically, you're not the only Canadian in my life who has another Jacob S in his phone and sometimes mistakenly sends me texts. So this is just my experience of Canada at this point. Sounds good.
Yeah, we're just fat thumbs. Okay, well, hey, since we last chatted, a lot has been happening on the geopolitical front, and of course that all works its way back to the farm gate. One of the big geopolitical events was the Friday meeting in Alaska between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Let's start there, and then we'll talk about the follow-up meeting that happened the next week with European leaders. So what did you make of the showcase that happened in Alaska?
The first thing I want to say, Shaun, is that, and this is a corrective that we could say every single time, but I think it's especially relevant now, and I've been thinking about it because I was offline for a week and a half because I was ill. And you would think coming back in from a week and a half offline that you would have missed a bunch of things and the world would have passed you by. Nothing fundamentally changed. All I missed was a week and a half of headlines. Everything is the same as when I left it. And I think there's a lesson in that, which is actually geopolitically, not that much is happening. Now, the media has to spin that things are happening. And the Trump administration, in particular in the United States, likes to make a news story a day so that they can dominate the news cycle and President Trump can do all of these things. But I think when you're thinking about like how geopolitics is working, this is the quietest geopolitics has been all year. I think it's actually a time to take a breath and think about the things that are actually changing on a broader scale and the things that are changing slowly over time that actually matter. And then what are we filling our coffers with every day or every week with what's going on? I say that as a lead into talking about this Russia-US summit in Alaska because it's a nothing burger. Nothing was fundamentally achieved. And neither of these powers actually controls what's going on here. I think we talked about this maybe a month ago or so. If you look at the amount of military support and funding that is going to Ukraine this year, it's gone from basically the United States to all Europe. The Europeans have been rightfully lambasted for not providing enough support to the Ukrainians beyond rhetorical support. They've been supporting them this year. They've been behind them. And Ukraine's future will be decided not by Moscow and not by Washington. It will be decided by Kyiv's relationship with Berlin and with Paris and with London and with some of these other European states. So for me, watching Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have this meaningless handshake in Alaska where they didn't actually agree to anything besides that they should have peace negotiations and nothing tangible came out of it. For me, it's a classic that was the reality show this week for President Trump. He got his meeting with Putin. He got to look tough. Russian press covered it as though they got some kind of concession from President Trump, and President Trump is finally coming around and he won't support the Ukrainians if things go forward. What has changed? Nothing has changed. It's not like the Ukrainians are going to give up because of this. And I think most importantly is the European reaction afterwards. Did any of these European leaders decide based on that meeting that they were going to stop supporting Ukraine? No, many of them canceled vacation. This is Europeans canceling vacation. This is some very serious stuff
in
here.
August.
Canceling in August, where, they could be in their summer palaces doing whatever. Canceled and came to the White House for a unified front to protect Zelensky from what happened the last time that Zelensky went to the White House. So for me, it's nothing. Russia wants to conquer Ukraine, wants to end Ukraine's existence. It failed. It lost. I think President Trump wants a Nobel Peace Prize and thinks he can just wave a magic wand and get the Ukrainians and the Russians to stop fighting. Why is that going to work now versus the last 4 times that he's tried it? So I think it's honestly nothing. I think the conflict continues exactly the way it has continued thus far. And unless the Europeans start blinking, if the Europeans go to Zelensky and say, "Hey, this is not going to work. Like you're going to have to pull back, or we're going to have to think about something different." Okay, then we should sit up in our chairs. But this Russia, U.S., Putin, Trump melodrama, I'm bored, Shaun. Like I've seen this movie before. What new has? I mean, maybe I'm being too blasé, but that's how I felt about it.
Yesterday, we're recording on Tuesday, August 26th, and yesterday I heard a report that President Trump had admitted that it's taking the peace process has proven to be a little bit more difficult than he first had stated. I don't think that's really a shock to many, as many were doubtful it was going to end, this conflict or war is going to end on day one of his second term. Should anything be made? There's been from conservative circles in Canada. There was a lot made about the fact that Mark Carney was not invited to that meeting in DC with the European leaders. Is that really a big deal? If you are correct that it was really a nothing burger that meeting was just as uneventful as the actual meeting in Alaska.
What is Canada going to do for Ukraine? Canada has bigger problems closer to home to deal with, and there's nothing that Canada is going to do that's going to be crucial for Ukraine going forward. The Ukraine story is a European story. This is about whether the Europeans are going to stop squabbling amongst themselves in their bureaucratic, hall of mirrors and actually decide to do something geopolitically, or whether they're just going to let Russia slowly bleed Ukraine dry. And I think it's the former. I don't think that Europe is going to sleepwalk into its own obsolescence. But for Canada, like what is Canada somehow geopolitically threatened if something happens with Russia and Ukraine? It's half a world away. What does Mark Carney have to do with this? What leverage does he have on any of the actors to actually move anything forward? So if I was Mark Carney, I would be grateful that they didn't decide to waste my time in something where I just had to shake hands and smile, but I had no leverage that I could actually use to affect the outcome in a meaningful way.
So who actually has the leverage here? Is it and like what you just said is Europe is kind of the big card here, but do they have leverage? Like who holds the leverage?
I think the US had significant leverage going into the year because they were the ones that were doing the majority support of Ukraine, whether it was funding, whether it was weapons, what have you. The Trump administration has pulled back on quite a bit of that, quite substantially. And the Europeans have filled in. So now this is about the Europeans. The other leverage there is also domestic Ukrainian politics. Earlier this year, Zelensky was not in a great position at home domestically. It seems like he's been able to shore things up there. But if you could start to get, war fatigue in Ukraine and people calling for Zelensky to step down and pointing out that there haven't been elections and that, this is not a democratic process and that he's outlived his welcome, those are some of the pressure points that we're talking about. But yeah, I think right now here today, the only countries that have leverage are the ones that are allowing Ukraine to continue the fight. And that's no longer the United States, that's Europe. So until Europe decides that it wants to take its ball and wants to go home and wants to let Russia gobble up Ukraine, which I don't think the Europeans will do, they're the ones that are going to have some significant source of leverage here going forward. Now, I guess you could say the Russians have some leverage and that they could say, hey, we're going to stop the war. But for whatever reason, that seems politically untenable for President Putin. Maybe he just wants Donetsk and these eastern portions of Ukraine, but since the start of the war, for years before the war, he kept on writing literal papers about how Ukraine didn't exist, how it was literally part of Russia, how it shouldn't be a state. And it seems to me that he is still deluded into that fantasy and that he thinks Russia is going to outlast and outsuffer everyone here. And I think he was right about that Russia was going to outlast the United States. And I think he's wrong that they're going to outlast the Europeans. I don't think the Europeans are going to let the Ukrainians fall.
It's closer to home for the Europeans than it is the U.S. in just geographically.
It's existential. It's not existential for the United States. It's not existential for Canada. It is existential for Europe.
It's fair. If you're a betting man, crystal ball, Jacob Shapiro, August 26, 2026. Is this war still going on?
Yes.
It is.
Yes. Why would it end? See no reason for it to end.
When does it end then? So like what? Because I remember when this first started, like you and I think, talked the first week, and there was speculation then this would be quick. This could be this is a long conflict. What ends it?
Well, I think it's important to divide the conflict up into phases, right? The first phase of this war was a Russian blitzkrieg to conquer all of Ukraine, to decapitate the regime in Kyiv, to get rid of Zelensky, to establish a pro-Russian puppet in Kyiv, and to conquer large swaths of the country. That failed. The Ukrainians beat them back. Then you had a Ukrainian counteroffensive phase where the Ukrainians, mistakenly it turned out, thought that they could take territory back from the Russians and thought that could create leverage to create some kind of peace deal. That blew up in their face. They didn't really make the gains that they thought they were going to make, and the Russians didn't care. The Russians just kept pounding on the places that they wanted to go forward. The current phase of the conflict is really a stalemate. The Ukrainians are holding their defensive lines. The Russians are slowly grinding out very small gains in eastern parts of the country that have basically been ground into nothing. So congratulations for the Russians for conquering these things. So when I say the war will still be here in a year from now, I'm saying it will continue at this level of stalemate. I don't think we're going to see some massive Russian offensive that's going to break through. I don't think the Ukrainians have the manpower to attempt a different counteroffensive. I think both sides are just trying to hold the line and then trying to get the best negotiated outcome they can get. I think the war ends, to your point, when there is regime change in one of these countries. So if President Putin falls, and remember we had the Prigozhin incident, like that was a real thing.
Yeah.
Then maybe you could see things change inside of Russia and the calculus around that change. If Zelensky, who was hemorrhaging support earlier in the year and the Ukrainians were running out of men to draft into the army and he was firing generals left and right, if he falls and if enough Ukrainians have left the country that they can't maintain the defense, then you could see something come into being. If the Europeans decide that, you know what, this war is hampering us, we really just need this to get done, we're going to go to Ukraine and say, hey, you need to give up X amount of territory, and then otherwise we'll give you all the other things. But let's give Putin his victory, and they can have the 4 oblasts that they want, and you come in here and let's start rebuilding Ukraine and let's start building, a European future in a multipolar world. Like those are examples of how the conflict ends, in my opinion.
When the war first started, and the sanctions around the world started being applied to Russia and specifically targeting the oligarchs, there was this thought in the ether that, it's, the oligarchs aren't going to stand for this, and Putin, his life's in danger, and that's going to end it. Regime change. We don't even we hear nothing about that anymore. What is the relationship between the oligarchs and Putin at this point?
It's a forced marriage, I think. And look, 2 years ago, we would have been talking nonstop about regime change because the Prigozhin incident, for your listeners who don't remember, Prigozhin was Putin's caterer-in-chief turned mercenary leader.
Yeah.
And he took some of his mercenaries and started marching on Moscow. And it was serious enough that Russian military started tearing up the highways to Moscow. And Russian soldiers died in the fighting between these two. Now, Prigozhin thought that he had leverage, and he was assassinated a couple of months later after he thought a deal where he was going to get whatever he wanted. That was a poor move on his part. But that was a real sign that there were members of the establishment who were not happy with him. Prigozhin doesn't get that far unless there are people behind the scenes who are not happy. I assume that Putin cleaned house after that, and for now, he's in a relatively stable position. But I think the historical metaphor here to keep in mind is think about Russia under the Tsars in the early 1900s. You might know this, Shaun. There was a war between Russia and Japan in the early 1900s, and everybody thought that the Japanese were these backwards, Asians who didn't know how to fight. The Japanese kicked the Russians' butts. Theodore Roosevelt actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the peace between Japan and Russia afterwards. And as a result of all the stress that Russia came under because they lost a lot of men and there was famine and there was economic catastrophe and it was an embarrassment, the Tsar had to make a lot of different reforms. The State Duma was created a couple of years after that because he had to give some power back to the people because the people were angry and he had to placate them. That said, that was around 1904, 1905. He held on for another 12 years. He held on long enough to help start World War I. You don't get the real Russian Revolution until the middle of World War I, when the country is just fed up and says, we don't want to deal with this guy anymore. I think that's the way to think about Vladimir Putin. I think we have a leader who made a catastrophic existential mistake in invading Ukraine, and he got beaten. And he's holding on for power, and the sclerotic, corrupt oligarchy that's around him is clinging to power as much as it possibly can. But the emperor has no clothes, and he is going to slowly bleed power and economic success and all of these other different things. And at a certain point, there will be too much pressure on the system and he will get replaced. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if it were 6 months from now. It could go on for another 15 years for all we know, as the Tsar Nicholas metaphor goes. But that's, I think, the real story here. Like Russia's fundamentally weak. That's why Russia wants to go to Alaska and shake hands, by the way, with President Trump. It makes Russia feel like it's the big guy at the table. It's powerful. The president of the United States has to take them seriously and is thinking about what they're wanting about. And then Putin goes and takes that back and says, look, I'm still Vladimir Putin. I'm still strong. People still have to take me seriously. I think that's part of the PR establishment around him. But
And that's
make no
part of the
mistake.
narrative that you hear from some North American media, that Putin got what he wanted from the meeting. That's what they're alluding to based on that last point you just said.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
what Putin really wanted was to conquer Ukraine, and he failed. He lost. And 20 years from now, when we get to know, how this developed over the next 20 years, I think historians will write the end of Vladimir Putin's rule in Russia was when he got his butt kicked when he tried to invade Ukraine and it didn't work. And yes, he clung to power for X number of years while the average Russian's experience of life declined and declined and declined until at last they couldn't suffer anymore and they wanted to get rid of him. I think that's the trajectory that Russia's on.
Yeah, bloody fascinating. Okay, let's move on to something in this week, which is the Prime Minister of South Korea visited the White House. There was a trade deal, MOU, I don't know how you want to put it, that was negotiated between the two countries. This is a bit of a follow-up visit. What did you take from the meeting at the Oval Office?
Gosh, an MOU. It's nice to know we won't have shortages of toilet paper anymore. The United States and South Korea have a free trade agreement. So all this nonsense about some like, oh, there's going to be a deal. There's already a deal. So maybe they just have to slap the Trump name on it. But for God's sakes, like I struggle with this because like there's already a deal between the two sides. It was an interesting moment because before the meeting, President Trump was tweeting or on Truth Social or whatever it is that he does about how the previous South Korean president, who was impeached for declaring martial law and basically trying to take over the country,
Yeah.
Trump was basically saying that guy got a raw deal. And what is South Korea doing? He was almost trying to give South Korea the Brazil treatment that he did with Bolsonaro. And to President Lee, the new president in South Korea, to his credit, even though he has fairly left-leaning credentials, if you look at his political history, this is a guy, I mean, I've heard him described as the Bernie Sanders of South Korea. I think it's a little strong, but it's
Wow,
not
that
that
left.
strong.
That left.
Like that's,
Wow.
that's what we're talking about. But he has been extremely pragmatic in terms of how he's governed. For instance, he's sought better relations with Japan. That's not what you would think from the South Korean left. He's sought better security relationships as part of a trilateral relationship against North Korea. That's not what you would expect the South Korean left to do. And he came to this meeting with President Trump, and he said the right things. He groveled. He kissed the ring. He doesn't want a problem with the United States because he knows that it's important for the South Korean economy not to mess up with the United States. This is an important relationship with him. So I think President Trump got what he wanted. He got a new South Korean president, basically, paying him homage. And I think President Lee walks out looking pretty good because he, at least so far, managed to handle the Trump relationship okay. Now, that said, we know what Trump's predilection is. So maybe Lula thought that at one point with Trump too. And it's just we're one truth bomb away from, South Korean domestic politics being back in ruin because President Trump doesn't like them. Also, I mean, South Korea has been a bugaboo for President Trump since the first term. He's talked about how he doesn't like U.S. troops there, that South Korea doesn't pay its fair share, that South Korea has a trade deficit with the United States, all the normal stuff that Trump says about these things. So I don't think the relationship is perfect, but for the meeting itself, I think Trump got his photo up and got a leader saying nice things to him, and at least President Lee walked out things not being worse than when he went in. And when he went in, things were not looking so great.
Yeah, I think everybody's goal that goes to the Oval Office is not to be Zelensky'd. That's kind of what everybody searches for. And I think the go ahead.
Well, no, this is actually one place where I'm extremely contrarian. I think Zelensky knew what he was doing.
Oh, really?
And I think Zelensky came out well. I think Zelensky came out of that meeting with Trump, and that was when all the Europeans freaked out and said, "Oh my God, we have to help this guy." I think Zelensky really showed the Europeans that the United States was not to be trusted anymore, and that's when he got all that European support on goal. Maybe that's being too generous to Zelensky, but remember, Zelensky, before he was a president, he's not a politician. He was a comedian.
Yeah.
He was a TV star in Ukraine. In some sense, he's the only world leader who has Donald Trump's expertise, which is reality TV and how to play to the cameras. So I'm sure that most leaders want to avoid the Zelensky treatment, but I think that Zelensky wanted that. I think Zelensky got what he wanted out of it. I think the treatment that most leaders want to avoid is what India's going through right now.
That
where
that is
they
frosty.
did all the right things. They did that, they kissed the ring. They thought they had everything lined up, and it was like, sorry, not good enough. Here's some tariffs. And if you complain, here's some more tariffs. Like that's the one you want to avoid.
I'm a broken record on this. I think all of the talk about the U.S. having some sort of comprehensive major trade deal with India that's going to be negotiated on the Trump timeline is absolutely naive and impossible. There is no record or historical like anecdote where we can look, we'll do it just like this other country. It is a complex quagmire of delusion inside India trying to negotiate that. I've heard that from people that have negotiated with India. It is turned into a very frosty relationship.
Yeah, and I think it's to US policy detriment. If you're going to pick a fight with China via a trade war, and if you're going to nearshore, and if you're going to do all these other different things, it would be really good to have India on your side. They have exactly the right demographics, resources, things like that you would want. But the United States is embracing Pakistan instead and just doing just about everything they can to thumb their nose at India, which I think India was really they were always going to be non-aligned. They were always jealously guarding their independence and policy. But the last 10 years, they've been closer to the United States than they'd been in their history. And I think the Modi government really thought that, the Modi-Trump bromance was real and that they had a finger on the pulse and that they were going to be able to do things with the Trump administration going forward. And they got, um, you know, a rude awakening.
Yeah.
And to your point, the Trump administration seems to think that it's just going to that it's just going to export U.S. ag goods into India, and that India is going to bend over and do whatever the United States wants, and that's not how it's going to work.
Yeah, the
Like
farmer
Modi couldn't
population
even.
doesn't allow that.
No, I mean Modi tried to pass agricultural reforms. He's the most popular leader in Indian history, arguably. He couldn't do it. We're talking about a country. I forget what the percentage is. Is it's more than 50% of Indians make their living off of agriculture. They can't. They're not going to buy U.S. soybeans and dairy products. Like what? Like what are you talking about? That's like that would be like self-immolating their economy by itself. So I'm with you. It's unrealistic, and the extent to which the United States has been so heavy-handed with India, I think, is a detriment because the U.S. and India as allies in a multipolar world makes a lot of sense. I mean, the another historical example for you. The British Empire, the sun would have probably set on the empire much earlier if they hadn't conquered India in the mid 1800s. And the sheer economic benefit that they wrung out of India allowed the British Empire to go from strength to strength for another 50, 60 years. There's no reason the United States couldn't have tried to use that same playbook. If you could get India on side, who needs China at that point? If you can get India to be your low cost manufacturer and wave away all the red tape and be aligned with you in the Indo-Pacific. But no, instead, the United States wants to chase mining deals in Pakistan.
Just to hop back quickly to the South Korea meeting this
Yes, sorry.
during that meeting, I'm curious on your thoughts. What stuck out to me was during the Q&A, President Trump kind of went off script like he does during those Q&As, where all of a sudden the meeting with South Korea is not really about South Korea. It's about media asks a whole wide range of questions. And they got on to North Korea. And President Trump started talking about how Kim Jong-un is a great guy. They have a special relationship. They talk about things that they probably even shouldn't talk about. How would that be viewed with South Korea in the room? Is that a touchy subject as it once was?
It would have been a much touchier subject with the previous South Korean government. So President Yoon was a hawk. And he was very, I don't want to say militant against North Korea, but somebody who wasn't trying to give peace a chance, somebody who thought, strength through security, might makes right, et cetera. This current government of South Korea, President Lee's government, is going to be more dovish, sort of like the Moon government, which is the government that was around when Trump had his negotiations with Kim Jong-un, as you might remember, in the first administration. So it wouldn't have landed as hard as it would have if it was the Yoon government. I also think you have to compare things in relative terms. Like, is that statement, it's certainly not more outrageous than President Trump meeting Kim Jong-un. Like all the things that happened in the first administration comparatively to President Trump saying that at a press conference are like, okay, whatever. Like there's really like no comparison there. But you were alluding to my non-functional, or maybe we should call it dysfunctional crystal ball earlier. We've heard from Iran and Israel this year. We've heard from Venezuela. we have not heard from North Korea, and the North Koreans are still sitting there with ICBMs and delusions of grandeur and conquering the South, and are probably not very happy with how things are going in the world. So things are quiet geopolitically right now, but the Korean Peninsula has been eerily quiet all year. I wouldn't be surprised if we get a little something something out of Korea here in the next couple of months.
Why quiet though? So is it strategic why they've been quiet all through this year, or is this a result of something that we haven't talked about?
Sean, I could lie to you and say that I have some unique insight on how the North Korean regime works.
Okay.
But anybody who tells you that they know why something is happening in North Korea is selling you snake oil. Yes, well, if you could get the worm on, maybe he'd be able to tell you something about what's going on inside there. I certainly can't tell you. I can just tell you. I mean, this is probably the last truly totalitarian state that is left in the world. And I mean that also from a media information perspective. It's impossible to get information out of North Korea. So all we can do is look at their behavior. And we could speculate, maybe China's telling them to be quiet because they don't want problems in the context of the trade war. Or maybe China's telling them, hold back until we're in serious trade negotiations with the United States. And then we want you to kick it up a notch because we'll come in and save the day. And then the United States will have to give us something in the trade negotiation. Maybe they're working on some big ICBM and they want to test it later. Maybe they saw what happened with Iran and they're like, that's not so good. We need to reconsider what we're doing. What if there are pagers inside of North Korea that we're worried about? I don't know. All we can say is that they're quiet. It's a little weird. And that history tells us they're not going to be quiet forever. They have a tendency of poking up their heads at very inopportune times.
We'll be talking again in about 30 days, Jacob. What key geopolitical items should we be watching for in these next 30 days between now and our next conversation?
Yeah, I alluded to this at the beginning, and it's what I would tell your listeners to focus on in general. Try to ignore the headlines. Headlines should be a little bit slow here for another week or so because the Europeans are still on vacation, everything else. Then we'll get the UN General Assembly and we'll get all of the reports about all the leaders that are meeting and all the deals that are being made. I'm sure things will continue to pop off in the Middle East. I mean, Israel is bombing Yemen, destroying Gaza, disarming Hezbollah, and having incursions into Syria. So it's not like the Middle East is quiet. It's not like Africa is quiet. What's happening in Sudan? What's happening with Ethiopia? I mean, you poke around the world, there are all these headlines happening. But the big story, I think, continues just to be we're moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And what the Trump administration is doing is accelerating that. And you're seeing that in everything from what inflation expectations are, what interest rates look like in the United States, what the value of the dollar is against harder currencies or even against gold or Bitcoin. That is the slow moving thing that matters more than anything else. So we can talk about all the crazy stuff that's going to happen in the next 30 days. I'm sure there will be plenty of it. But the big story here, the thing to keep your eye on, is how multipolarity is changing things and what that means in terms of the cost of energy in your own country, what that means in terms of how your country is situated when it comes to cutting edge technology, specifically artificial intelligence and data centers and robotics and things like that. And then how these trade relationships are going to unwind. I think we've gotten a reprieve from the tariffs so far this year because a lot of companies knew what was coming and stacked up a lot of inventory. They're going to start running out. So are we going to is the United States going to kick the can down the road again with China? Is inflation really going to start rearing its head because all that inventory is starting to get soaked up? And then what pressure does that put on the Trump administration going forward? So that's the big story. And it's a slow moving story that doesn't generate headlines. It's much more exciting to be like, oh, Putin and Trump in Alaska and Cambodia and Thailand shooting at each other. And the Israelis did something else terrible. But the big story here is, the world is looking at the United States and saying, we don't want to trust them going forward. So we need to make nice with them in the short term. But what do we need to do in the long term so that 3-5 years from now, when President Trump, asks us to kiss the ring in your President Lee example in South Korea, and there's no kiss forthcoming. There's just actually, we don't need you anymore. We forged other geopolitical relationships. Have a nice day.
Jacob, if somebody wants to talk to you about your services from a geopolitical consulting standpoint, or maybe as a keynote speaker at an upcoming conference, how do they get a hold of you?
You can email me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. I've got the Jacob Shapiro podcast and the Geopolitical Cousins podcast if you want to hear what's on our minds. And then I work at the Bespoke group. But yeah, I mean, if any of this is interesting to you, just jacob@jacobshapiro.com. That's the easiest place to get to me.
Hey, man, great stuff. Hey, appreciate it. This has been another episode of the Frontlines podcast. Jacob, we'll talk to you again in a month.
Sounds great. Unless something happens sooner, for all we know,
That is
For all
true.
we know, Taylor Swift will be sent to Moscow to negotiate for some future peace deal.
Well, Rodman did the North Korea thing, so why not? We'll send Taylor Swift. Everybody loves Taylor Swift. Like, come on.
Well, and Rodman did. I actually feel bad for Rodman because he actually thought he was doing something good, and he didn't realize that he was being used by the North Koreans for nothing. But a story for another time.
True enough. Okay, cheers, everybody.